What is the return on investment? I know you shared with me some things about physical and mental injury in workplace covers, but just share with the listener, what is the return on investment?
So whenever I'm approaching any topic, I'll always talk about the moral, the legal, and the economic aspects. So there's always those three aspects around any business case. Now, depending how you speak to, might change the order that you're running. But I'm going to talk to the economics, to the dollar for a moment. And I'm always a little bit uncomfortable doing this because I do it to prove a point that there is a return on investment that every organization should make. But I'm also aware I'm talking dollars when I'm talking about people that are, significantly impacted. So if you just put a marker in that one for a moment. So the average costs for a mental health claim in Victoria, state of Victoria, in 2020 was $200,000 to $200,000. Compare that to a non-psychological claim, a non-mental health claim, about 96. So what does that 200 actually mean? I've had this conversation with a number of business owners. I said, okay, then. So let's talk about EBIT, your earnings before interest and tax. The bit you've got left in your pocket when you finish doing business. How much do you have to actually generate in terms of revenue to get that 200,000 from one claim back? So if you've got a healthy, EBIT of 20%, you're looking for another $1 million revenue because you've had one mental health claim. It's staggering. You can show me an organization that can't put a healthy strategy in place for less than 200,000, and they're not doing the right things. I've put strategies in place for less than half of that in very large organizations. And I remember speaking to a financial colleague, and it was another company a couple of years ago, and they said, "Where's he sat on the profit and loss? Where does it show on the ledger?" Yeah, it doesn't. And I'm only talking about insured costs. Any OHS person will tell you about the iceberg, and the iceberg where only 11% of the costs are visible. I'm only talking about the bit you can see. So the costs to industry and the impact of individuals, hugely significant. But I always say it's a no-brainer. The business case, it's always been much easier to prove a business case around mental health than your traditional OHS.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a latent OHS problem in your machine, and it's there and it's not good, but nobody's being harmed by it. If you've got a wellness issue, it's impacting your business now. It's impacting your business today to some level.
Yes. And you make the point about only 11% being visible, the tip of the iceberg, because there are, the cost of turning over staff, the cost of absenteeism, the pressure it puts on others in the workplace that are left behind. It's just a snowballing effect, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's an avalanche. And recruiting has never been harder. We're in, so I'll speak I know your podcast goes worldwide, but in Australia at the moment, we're enjoying some of the lowest unemployment rates since the mid-70s. So to go out and actually recruit people and find people is extremely difficult at the moment and extremely costly. So again, apologies for speaking dollars when I'm talking about people's wellness and pain and suffering, but yeah, think about those numbers.
Yes. Well, you mentioned there were three aspects, and morally, legally, and economically. And Australia has, and it was interesting to hear you say we're leading, because certainly in Victoria, in New South Wales and Queensland, Victoria on the eastern seaboard, and I think it's going national. There's new legislation introduced in October last year, in New South Wales at least, that put a legal obligation on not just companies but their leaders. Is that right, Mike? There's a legal obligation now to manage or mitigate psychosocial risk. Is that have I got that right?
I'll put a little bit more colour around that, Ron. So it's different states and territories that are in the process of implementing the psychosocial health regulation. And what it is, it's a piece of legislation that introduces some of the terminology we would now use and some of the obligations around duty of care, particularly from a psychosocial or a wellness point of view, into the legislation that already exists. So all the states and territories, apart from Victoria, are under the workplace health and safety regulations. Victoria, for reasons that I won't go into, didn't cross over to those regulations that everybody else did. So Queensland, all the other states have now put in a version of the psychosocial health regulations, which says the duty of care that you had to provide, to consult, to have a safe working place, all the things that we know and love around OHS, there's now an obligation from a wellness point of view, a mental health point of view. Where Victoria differs, Victoria, there isn't, as we speak today, I checked last week, there isn't a definitive date. They talked about the end of Q1 this year, that the regulations would go live in Victoria. The regulations are going to be different in Victoria. There's more obligations on an organisation. So one of the points of difference in Victoria is that for organisations of a certain size, there's an obligation to report to WorkSafe where there has been any complaints around discrimination, sexual harassment or discrimination, and to make those reports on a 6-monthly basis. So when you think about that, that's quite a game changer. You always had to report for fatalities, for falls from height, for serious injuries. Now they're saying, but if there is an investigation around something that can cause mental harm and distress, we want to know every 6 months.
Wow.
So there's Victoria have done what they do sometimes, and they've took a slightly different path. But yeah, the legislation, there's always been an obligation to look after people's health and well-being. This is really a little bit retrospective to say yes, but now these terms need to be better defined, and the leadership of organisations will be held responsible. So we're talking again about Victoria, where the OHS legislation lives in as criminal legislation. It's not civil legislation. For breaches of health and safety, you're in the same courts as the gangsters and the people that do terrible things. So the legislative landscape is changing very, very quickly. It's built on, by and large, around an international standard, 45003. So if you need to get some an early night and want some light reading, it's a great standard, and that really builds a very robust framework for what or how wellness should be managed in an organisation. It's very, very holistic. It talks about from the inductions, the trainings, the supervision, etc. And it clearly, as you mentioned, it clearly puts the responsibility with the senior people, the company directors. And then this is, when you think about, if you go back 15 years and you talk to a company director, if a forklift hits you, Ron, God forbid, or if a forklift hits me, we're done. That's it. If I work a 60-hour week for a year and you work a 60-hour for a week, it might just bounce off you, but it might significantly damage my well-being. So all of a sudden we've got a duty of care. The legal term of duty of care. You've got to do what's reasonably practicable. I think we've invented a new language based in fog, and now we're saying, okay, I can understand the forklift analogy. The fall from height, you're going to land, it's going to be bad. But now we've got a hazard that's not that well defined, that it impacts Mike, but it doesn't impact Ron. How do I manage that? How do I know I've done enough? And they're the questions I'm getting every week. What is it that we need to do? How do we know it's working?
Well, I know in medicine, the move is hopefully towards personalised medicine, because we are all individuals, and what's stressful to me may not be stressful to you, but it doesn't mean it's not stressful to you. And it's interesting to hear you talk about, because internationally that ISO 45003 has certainly set a standard. When I became aware of this legislation in New South Wales, and I think it's going to be rolled out nationally, at the same time, the Grattan Institute just recently released in February of 2023. Now, they're a big research organisation for our international listeners. Put out a report saying that Australia was sleepwalking into a healthcare disaster. And so I saw these two things juxtaposed on one another. Here is an admission that government has failed in public health. And on the other hand, I think, in rugby, it's used to be called a hospital pass. You'd pass the ball to somebody else to take the heavy tackle. And this is what actually I can see is happening for organizations. I mean, it's a great opportunity. And you talk about moral and legal and economic case. Well, the moral case for a third of our lives to be focused on health and wellness is a pretty compelling argument. I mean, we really have handed corporations a tough gig.
We have. I'll just flash back to something you said then that reminded me of a conversation I had only last week, where somebody was putting an argument to me. They said, we don't have a health system. We've got a sickness system.
Yes, well, this is a common theme on this podcast, Mike.
Yeah, we've got a system that it's reactive, and there are proactive elements there, by and large, all of which have came in the last 20 years, and are far outweighed by the reactive aspects of the sickness system that we have. The load, or the challenge, I guess, that we're putting in, not just corporates, because there's 42% of Australians work in organisations of less than 50 people. They're organisations that haven't got big budgets to do things, but almost half of the workforce that we have, is out there. So it's not just a corporate topic. I've talked corporate for a while, but and I'm spending a bit of time talking to small to medium enterprises. I'm speaking to a Chamber of Commerce later this week regarding what can a small organisation do. We don't even have a health and safety person. What can we do? And there is some fantastic and free resources available from, so going back to the legislation, it won't go national as a piece of legislation, but it will be enacted nationally via each state and territory. And there's some excellent information out there that tells you what you need to do. But unfortunately, it still needs a bit of decoding. So as a small business owner that's got a microbrewery or a fruit and veg distributor, it's not an easy read, and that's where they need people to go in and to break this down and not monetize it. They need to be able to go out and get some short, sharp direction in terms of, if you do these things, you can negate these things, and that's actually a piece of it's a piece of work that I'm pulling together now, and I'm going back to the horse's mouth and saying, well, what do you know and what do you not know? Because the first thing, whether you're a corporate organisation or you're a John, Paul, George and Ringo who've got a removal firm, what do you know today? What are the problems today that you might have? And it's starting that conversation, because until you know what your challenges are, it's very, very difficult to put a solution in place. And again, across such a broad topic that impacts so many individuals out there, and it impacts some and not others. So it's a really, really challenging one for any business or any organisation to manage.
Again, talking to people, asking how they are. How are you okay? This is how we started our conversation. You've now, if I was going to ask you if you were going to design the perfect HR system, what would you do? But you've just found out that the company that you've been head of, the HR division, has won a Global Health and Safety Initiative award. Well, that's a reflection of something being done, right? I wondered if you could tell us what it was. I mean, you've obviously outlined some of the things holistically that you've been doing there.
Yeah. Look, again, I won't talk on Bosch's behalf because I'm no longer employed by them. But
generically,
we put a strategy in place in Australia and New Zealand, and that's been acknowledged at a global level. And ahead of many other projects, they'll look for a project that shows initiative and value add every year. And the announcement hasn't gone out, but it may have done very, very well and took out the first place. So, I'm absolutely thrilled for the guys who will now continue to put that strategy in place. And I'll just talk a little bit to the points of difference. The question that you often get when you're putting a mental health strategy in place is, how do we know it's working? The first question is, what does success look like? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we know it's working? And, if you look at 45003, there's suggested, measures for improvement. We took the usual, ROI type KPIs. We could monitor progress, but we also took another set of metrics, and how many of the senior leadership group attend the wellness events that are scheduled? So most organizations, or many organizations, they'll schedule lunchtime events and after hours events around wellness, and whether it be yoga classes or God forbid bowls of fruit. But how many of the executive actually show for those? And that was one of the questions that I got from a couple of organizations to say, well, yeah, they're available, but you never see the senior management going along. Now, I don't think I look good in a leotard. I'll put that out there. But the fact that you're present and you participate, and then, through your presence in an event, you're adding a legitimacy to it. It's people do what's important to the boss, invariably. And if the boss has shown an interest around that topic, one of the things that we've done as part of the launch was we asked every senior executive to make a home video, 30 seconds. So I said, look, I just need 30 seconds of your time. Easiest request you're going to get today. I want you to do a video. The first part of the sentence is, I look after my own mental health and well-being by, and then fill in the dots. And it was great. It was learned a lot about people and what to get up to when they're not at work. But it really opened up a conversation, and that went global. That went over on the internal systems. 400,000 people, I guess we've got to say that. And you got people being vulnerable and talking about what they do to ensure they've got a balance. I don't believe in work-life balance. I just think there's a life balance. And so yeah, some of the key aspects and the focus were around leadership at a senior level, because until you get that senior buy-in, and they did, the team run with it.
Fantastic. I could just imagine that would be a real eye-opener for the whole team. It's interesting too, because you said that in your culture circle of three things, individual health is still there, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I started with this doesn't matter whether you're the executive telling us how I look after my health and well-being, or whoever in an organization. That's a really fundamental question, how does an organization affect that? What are some of the things you've tried and worked that have been there?
Things that I think it's always good to learn from the things you don't get right.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked with organizations where, we run with the Are You OK? Which is a great initiative, a fantastic initiative. But what if somebody's not okay on? What if somebody really opens up and says, well, I've got debt issues, and, the kids are apparently using drugs, and, I don't know how I'm going to make the mortgage at the end of the month. And how do you close the conversation? So I've worked with organizations to back end that conversation to say, okay, then this is where the help is available, etc. And we put a framework around there. One of the things that blew me away, to the point I actually trained up to become an instructor, was the mental health first aid training. That's an Australian thing. Extremely proud to say that. And the mental health first aid training, I would say it's the best 2 days training I would recommend for anybody, because it tells you the unvarnished, this is what mental health is, the unvarnished truth. And it tells you how to start the conversations. It doesn't try to turn you into a Freud or a doctor, but it just helps you get people to the people that can help them. So yeah, I was blown away with the training. I went and followed up and now deliver mental health first aid training, because it's all about the conversation. Yeah. It's all about the conversation.
Yeah. Now, another issue that's pretty big in all industries, a lot of industries, is burnout. It's a topic on many people's minds, whether they know it or not. It took, sounds like, from our initial conversation, it's not always obvious to an individual. How do we define burnout?
But burnout, the term gets thrown around quite a lot. I'm burned out. I'm over this week. I'm just burned out. And burnout is it's actually described by the World Health Organization as a workplace phenomena. It's not described as a sickness. It's described as a workplace phenomena. And they talk about emotional exhaustion, a depersonalization, and a lack of sense of personal accomplishment are the three academic triggers that they'll look for. And And what does it actually look like when you're having a conversation with someone? Burnout, you're not going to feel better after the long weekend. You're not going to feel better after the week in Byron Beer. You're still going to come back tired. You're still going to come back fatigued. You find people who were once very, very proactive will have a very, very negative narrative on things, and it's hard to shift and hard to move. So burnout is where too much for too long, and you're not getting the chance to recover. You're not getting the chance to pull back. So people say, well, what's the difference between stress and what's the difference between burnout? The burnout is the long haul. Burnout is where it's not peaks and troughs. That's the best layperson's synopsis I can give around that. But and it's prolific. It's prolific.
Do you have statistics or any idea of how prolific that is, or your own personal? I mean, it's a tough question.
There's lots of data out there. I always think with this topic, it's hard to put a metric you can hang your hat on, because, as we mentioned earlier on, we don't like talking about it.
Yeah.
So
who knows?
By the time we start picking the statistics up, we're at the back end of the equation, where all the things we've tried haven't worked. But burnout, chronic fatigue, you just can't think positively about things. You're often associated with long hours or big hours, where people they're not even functioning at 60% of the best, because they're just tired. Somebody once said to me, I knew I was getting towards burnout, Mike, because I was waking up tired.